Thank you, Amy. This is a traditional song, Great is Thy Faithfulness. But it's a reminder also that in spite of the words that we may sing, words like Father, sin, it is God within and the errors and all of that. So change the words however you need to within yourselves, because we are talking about God within. So please sing along with me. The words are up on the screen for you. Great is thy faithfulness, O God my Father. There is no shadow of turning with thee. Thou changest not, thy compassions, they fail not. As thou hast been, thou forever will be. Together. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Summer and winter, springtime and harvest, sun, moon, and stars in their courses above, join with all nature in manifold witness to thy great faithfulness, mercy, and love. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Pardon for sin and a peace that endureth, thine own dear presence to cheer and to guide, strength for today and bright hope for tomorrow, blessings all mine with 10,000 beside. Everybody, great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me.
Thanks a lot, Deidrey. I just needed the pressure of something to live up to. Once upon a time, in the ancient city of Haran in Upper Mesopotamia, there was an idol salesman. His father carved the idols in his workshop. The son took the idols and sold them in the marketplace. But the son wasn't the greatest salesman on the planet. He called out to passers-by, shouting, "Who will buy my idols?" "They won't help you." "But they can't hurt you." "Who will buy my idols?" Now, that idol salesman didn't sell very many idols. Be surprised? For some reason, the townspeople just weren't inspired to buy them. They should have been. They were accustomed to worshiping such idols. In fact, when the idol salesman made fun of the idols, the people were downright horrified. They watched as he took his idols to the river, pushed their faces into the water, and commanded them to drink. Drink, he said. Drink. But the idols didn't drink. What the idol maker and the town people soon realized was that that idol salesman didn't much like selling idols. One day when he was left alone in the workshop, he took a hammer and smashed all except the largest of the idols. Then he placed the hammer in the hand of the surviving idol. When the idol maker returned, his mouth dropped open in shock. "What happened?" he asked. His son answered, "The idols got into a fight. And the big one smashed all the other ones." "What are you talking about?" asked his father. "That's ridiculous. These idols have no life or power. They can't do anything." "Well, that's what I've been trying to tell you," said the son. "How can you worship something that doesn't see or hear or do anything? Or do you any good?" Now, Terah, the idol maker, was so incensed that he said, "Dare you deny the gods of our people? Get out of my sight." "May God forgive you," said his son. "No more will I live with you and your idols." And that is when Abram took his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot and moved to Canaan. How many of you remember that story in the book of Genesis? I'd be surprised if you did, because it wasn't in the book of Genesis. This is what Genesis did say. "Now the Lord said to Abram, 'Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you.'" And this is one of the most significant passages in the entire Bible. The writers meant to show that God chose Abram and his descendants from among all the families of the earth. But it didn't say anything about Abram's father being an idol maker. Now, if the story of Abram smashing his father's idols was not in Genesis, and I didn't make it up, where did it come from? Some of the rabbis told similar stories, but this story came from Islamic tradition. Chapter 3 of the Quran states, "O people of the scripture," meaning Jews and Christians, "why do you dispute about Abraham while the Torah and the gospel were not revealed until after him? Have you then no sense? Abraham was neither a Jew nor a Christian, but he was a true Muslim, and he joined none in worship with Allah." Now, how do you feel about that? I get it about Abraham not being a Christian. Does the Bible tell us that Abraham was a Jew or an Israelite? I always thought it did. What do you think? Actually, it doesn't. I was wrong. The people known as Jews were named for the country of Judah, which didn't yet exist in Abraham's time. And Israelites were descendants of Jacob, who was also called Israel. Jacob was Abraham's grandson. Technically speaking, Abraham could not have been a Jew or an Israelite. Was Abraham a Muslim? Well, that depends on whom you ask. A Muslim is a person who adheres to the religion known as Islam. And the basic principle of Islam is submission to a unique and personal God, Allah. Allah is simply the Arabic word meaning God. So my opening story, which is a part of Islamic tradition, describes Abraham's admission to God. And even many Jews buy into this story. Jews, Christians, and Muslims all can agree that Abraham was a Hebrew. The word Hebrew basically means the man who came from across the Euphrates. Abraham came from across the Euphrates. So by definition, Abraham was a Hebrew, and as shown by his submission to a unique and personal God, he could be called a Muslim. Now, we might argue that Islam was founded by the Prophet Muhammad, and the Quran was written several centuries after the life of Abraham. But Muslim tradition holds that Islam is the pure religion of Abraham. They believe it was restored and extended by God through his prophet, Muhammad. Now, Muslim tradition also holds that Abraham was the founder of all three monotheistic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Can we agree on that? According to Muslims, Abraham was the first to attack pagan idol worship, and he was the first to introduce the idea of monotheism, the shared belief in only one all-powerful God. All three religions trace their heritage to Abraham. Historically, that creates a problem. Outside of Scripture, there's no historical evidence that Abraham ever lived. But there must have been a prototype. Somebody, somewhere, and sometime before Genesis or the Quran were written, introduced the idea of one omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent God. And it's safe also to suggest that somebody, before the Ten Commandments were introduced in the book of Exodus, attacked the prevalent worship of idols. I suggest that it doesn't really matter who that was. Can we agree to call that somebody Abraham? Unity belief is loosely based on Jewish tradition by way of Christianity. And our tradition, therefore, is based on the story as told in Genesis. Genesis says it was in Haran that God called Abraham and directed him to migrate to Canaan. Abram and Sarai had been chosen to fulfill God's historical purpose. Now, what that historical purpose is the issue debated by Jews, Christians, and Muslims to this day. Unity teaches that the Bible's talking to us, you and me. But with that in mind, I invite you to imagine yourself in Abram's place. Think about that. Are you willing to walk for a moment in Abram's sandals? He's been promised a good land and becoming the ancestor of numerous people who will eventually become a great nation. But there were strings attached. Abram had to leave behind almost everything with which he was familiar. He had to step out of his comfort zone. Think about that. Would you be willing to take similar steps in Abram's shoes? In unity, we acknowledge that God offers each of us unlimited abundance. It's there for the taking. How many of us, like Abram, are willing to take those steps outside of our comfort zones? How many of us are willing to make the changes in our habits and surroundings that enable us to access the good God promises us? I was impressed by a statement in a daily guide I found in an old Science of Mind magazine. And I quote, "Here's where spirit comes in. We've all felt that divine nudge. The part of us that yearns to break free, do something new, take a chance. There is a hitch. In the previous paragraph, it asked, how many of us have turned our backs on a new venture, making a new friend, taking a class, or asking someone for help because of old stuff that told us we can't or we shouldn't? Can't or shouldn't are tools my ego has used to keep me tightly boxed in, where I live the same life, thought the same thoughts, with the same results I've always had. And I have to confess, every positive turning point in my life has occurred when I'd taken a risk, stepped out of my comfort zone. Now, if Abram said, "No, I don't want to go," there would be no Old Testament story. And if there was no Old Testament story, there'd be no New Testament and no Quran. And the chances are there would be no unity tradition. But Abram did go. He was 75 years old when he left Haran. He left behind everything he knew, went to the place God promised, and had to adopt a far more primitive lifestyle than he was used to. It couldn't have been easy. Are you still imagining what it must have been like for Abram? Think about it. I've thought about it. At my age, life at home is more attractive to me than it's ever been. Do you agree with me that Abram's response exemplifies the faculty of faith? Imagine having the faith that would allow you to take the risks and to visualize the fulfillment of all God's promises for you. Now, unity tradition suggests that because there's little historical evidence for these Bible stories, the writers probably intended for us to interpret them metaphysically. That in mind, Unity's co-founder Charles Fillmore compiled a metaphysical Bible dictionary in which he described characteristics represented by each Bible character and other elements of the stories. And he tells us that metaphysically, Abraham or Abram represents the faculty of faith. And Mr. Fillmore tells us that each character or element represents an aspect of our personalities. So I ask myself, how does Abraham show up in my consciousness? And I invite you to ask yourself the same question. Now, I'm not always comfortable answering that question. In good times, it's easy. But when I'm under stress or facing challenges, my faith in God's promise tends to lag. You know what I'm saying? If we read further in Genesis, however, we find that our lapses are normal. Even Abraham's faith didn't always measure up. When famine came to Canaan, Abraham in desperation left the land that God had promised. God had one plan, Abraham had another, and the fulfillment of God's promise was then in jeopardy. Now, if you've never put aside God's plan for you because you thought you had a better plan, you are more advanced than I am. I'm sure you've never allowed your fear to make you say can't or shouldn't. Have you? Well, don't beat yourself up over it. Despite Abram's lack of faith, God's grace saved the day. The grace of God suggests to me that God does not expect us to be perfect. God does expect us to try. So God's grace put Abram back on the right track. Are you still walking in Abram's shoes? You wouldn't make the same mistake twice, would you? If we're to take the Genesis story literally, Abram did make the same mistake twice. On 2 occasions, he claimed that Sarai was not his wife, in the hope that he would be protected or gain better circumstances for himself. But however many times Abram suffered a lapse of faith, he always ended up back in the promised land. Thanks to God's grace, the promise was still alive. And God promised to make the descendants of Abram a great nation. But there was one very serious problem. Abram was 75 years of age when he left Haran. Abram and Sarai had no descendants. And they might be forgiven for doubting God's promise to them. In fact, they had a good laugh over it. How could that promise be fulfilled? Do you believe in all God's promises? Now, tradition is a wonderful thing. Tradition. In Abram's day, people believed that barrenness and fertility were controlled by God. It was a custom that a wife could give her maid to her husband and then claim the child as her own. Now, Beth's familiar with that story, but I have to tell you now, even given the fact that I have no male descendant and Beth does not have a maid, that ain't gonna happen. Sarai offered that possibility to Abram. Now, Charles Fillmore might disagree. It's not in the Metaphysical Bible Dictionary, but my metaphysical glossary suggests that Sarai represents tolerance. That kind of tolerance is no longer customary, even if it is in the Bible. In fact, that kind of tolerance went out of style before the writer finished the story. And that's probably a good thing. I'll have no interest in raising a teenager when I'm in my 90s. That doesn't work because I will be my 90s before then. So Hagar provided for Abram the son Sarai seemingly could not. Abram was 86 years of age. When Ishmael was conceived, Hagar forgot her status as slave. I'm better than my mistress, she thought. And she didn't hide her feelings from Sarai. And Sarai did not hide her feelings from Abram. It's all your fault, she said. What are you going to do about it? Did Abraham respond sympathetically? He became history's very first passive-aggressive husband. Not my problem, he thought. She's your slave girl, he said. You handle it. Have you noticed the role egos play in these stories? The question is, am I influenced by spirit or by ego? Did the birth of Ishmael solve the problem of the inheritance? Arabs say yes, for they trace their lineage through Ishmael to Abraham. Genesis, however, was written by Jews. Now, we regularly say all things are possible with God. Do we believe it? How many of us would question it if God promises children when we're 90 or 100 years old? I might laugh at such an idea even to the age I am now. I have faith that God would not promise that. We know the story. The promise was fulfilled. When Abraham was 100 years old, Sarah gave him the long-awaited son, to whom they gave the name Isaac. Now, the birth of Isaac had been a lifelong dream for Abraham and Sarah. The first part of the promise had been fulfilled. Their journey had already been stressful, but the greatest challenge was yet to come. God gave Abraham the final test. He directed Abraham to submit Isaac as a burnt offering. Can you imagine God, the good, making such a demand? I can't. But this passage illustrates how perceptions of God have changed over the centuries. In fact, the passage affirms a change that had already occurred. It refers to a time when human sacrifice was the custom. Then it explains that God no longer requires human sacrifice. Just when Abraham was ready to do the dirty deed, the angel of the Lord said to him, "Do not lay your hand upon the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you've not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Now, the Jews cite this story as evidence that God abhors human sacrifice. Some go so far as to suggest that Abraham failed the test of faith because he didn't refuse to sacrifice his son. And that works for me. Abram is notable for having smashed his father's idols. Now, this part of the story comes from Islamic tradition, but that's okay. We can learn from the metaphysics of the Quran. We could even learn from metaphysically interpreting the Wizard of Oz. We might even say that Abram followed the yellow brick road from Haran to Canaan, to Egypt and back to Canaan. Can you accept the idea the yellow brick road is your spiritual path? It's the way to go, but it's fraught with hazards and distractions. Now, idols represent gods other than the one omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent God we know. We're all familiar with the commandment against allowing other gods into our lives. And how many of us believe in other gods? None of you are going to admit it, are you? I am serious. How many of us ever worship other gods? Now be careful before you answer that. How many of us have ever placed money, things, or pleasures above our God consciousness? Our Abram consciousness is married to our Sarai consciousness. And Sarai in Hebrew means contentious, dominating, or quarrelsome. Let's face it, Sarai shows up in our consciousness now and then. And when that happens, we realize that our emotions and affections are divine, but we fall short of fully understanding our need to connect them with spirit rather than material things. Have you ever noticed the Sarai in you dominating your Abram consciousness? Smashing idols represents the release of any tendency in worship to worship material goods, comforts, or pleasures of the flesh at the expense of our spiritual consciousness. Hooray for Abram for getting rid of those false gods. And as we travel along the yellow brick road, our goal is to change the names of our Abram and Sarai qualities to Abraham and Sarah qualities. Unity writer Elizabeth Sand Turner wrote that the change in name always denotes a change in character, so pronounced that the old name will no longer apply to the new person. The difference between Abram and Abraham is akin to Abram fully knowing the first four unity principles that we recited this morning. Abraham not only knows them, but lives them. He puts them into action. Think how wonderful it would be if you had the ability to bring all your ideas into manifestation. Sarah is no longer contentious. In Hebrew, the name Sarah means noble woman. She represents the feminine side of human nature. And this is true even for those of us who claim to be macho males. This is our intuitive and emotional nature. Sarah, in each of us, has advanced to a level in which we never allow material conditions to rule us. Are we there yet? If you're like me, you realize that there are hazards and distractions along the yellow brick road. Take, for example, Sarah's inability to have a child. She allowed Abraham to take her maid Hagar as a surrogate mother. The resulting birth of Ishmael did not solve Abraham's problems. God's promise could not yet be fulfilled. The lesson is that when we attempt to force our good, the result is seldom satisfactory. Are you ready to release the outcome to God? The promise was to be fulfilled through the birth of Isaac. And when God told Abraham and Sarah of the impending birth, they laughed. But God had the last laugh. In Hebrew, the name Isaac means God laughs. Metaphysically, the quality of Isaac represents our next step along the yellow brick road. This is our full consciousness of our oneness with God. Another way of saying it is that we are born again into a spiritual consciousness. We have to let go and release all concerns to God. Now, the end of the yellow brick road is the promised land. We reach the promised land when we're fully conscious of our divine nature. This is when all God's promises to us are fulfilled. Are we there yet? I'm not. I know I'll encounter more hazards and distractions on my spiritual journey, and I know I'm making progress because I'm spending less and less time on each succeeding distraction. More and more, I'm enjoying the previews of life in the promised land, or as Jesus described it, the kingdom of heaven. And I can feel my progress. The more often I say this, the less awkward I feel. It is outside my comfort zone, but maybe this time it will be easy. I love you all, and that's the truth.
Wonderful message as always, Charlie. Charlie said, "Do you believe all things are possible with God?" Let us sing this one. Only believe, only believe, all things are possible. Only believe, only believe, only believe, all things are possible. Only believe. Let us sing. God, I believe. God, I believe. God, I believe. All things are possible as I believe. God, I believe. God, I believe. All things are possible as I believe.
In preparation for our time of meditation, I quote from Paul's letter to the Ephesians, chapter 4. You were taught to put away your former way of life, your old self, corrupt and deluded by its lusts, and to be renewed in the spirit of your minds, and to clothe yourselves with the new self, created according to the likeness of God, in true righteousness and holiness. In that spirit, I affirm oneness with God and with all people, and new possibilities become apparent as my attitudes and situations begin to shift. In partnership with God, I live from the understanding that greater good is possible. I have faith there is a purpose unfolding within the unknown and the unseen in my life. Through faith, I know that God's power is greater than any circumstance. And with faith, I can see new possibilities where none appeared to be. I release the thoughts and feelings that have been holding me back. I accept that I have a new life in spirit, a life filled with new experiences and accomplishments. Now it is time. I release and I let go in the silence. In the silence. In this state of restful meditation, I renew my faith and spirit to bring order, peace, abundance, and wholeness to all outer conditions. I am blessed. And so it is. Amen.
God, I believe. God, I believe. God, I believe. All things are possible as I believe. God, I believe. God, I believe. All things are possible as I believe. And in echoing the message of Charlie's message, we have a job to do, and that is to feed our faith, to feed our faith. God is the dawning light within me, feeding my faith, deepening my faith. God is the dawning light within me, feeding and deepening my faith. Love is the dawning light within me, feeding my faith, deepening my faith. Love is the dawning light within me, feeding and deepening my faith. Peace is the dawning light within me, feeding my faith, deepening my faith. Peace is the dawning light within me, feeding and deepening my faith. Grace is the dawning light within me, feeding my faith, deepening my faith. Grace is the dawning light within me, feeding and deepening my faith. Joy is the dawning light within me, feeding my faith, deepening my faith. Joy is the dawning light within me, feeding and deepening my faith. Hope is the dawning light within me, feeding my faith, deepening my faith. Hope is the dawning light within me, feeding and deepening my faith. Feeding and deepening my faith. Feeding and deepening my faith. Feed my faith. Feed my faith.